completely out of my wheelhouse, so I just wanted to know, because you mentioned about it continuing. So, as it continued, are these Christians in the Sasanian Empire, did they eventually go on to become the Assyrian Church of the East, or were they the Syriac Orthodox Church? What became of them moving forward?
That's a good question. There was a time, I think, when, from the beginning of the kind of settlement with the formal settlement with the Iranian Church, it was what we would call the Church of the East, or what people used to call Nestorian, even though, it's probably, it would be highly debatable whether anyone had any strong feelings about Nestorius in the government of the church or at the level of the monarchy. But the Diophysite Christology was definitely what was espoused, whether you want to call that Nestorian or not. However, after the invasion of Rome in the early 7th century and the conquest of most of the Roman Near East, the king deposes the patriarch of Seleucia Ctesiphon, leaves the Catholicosate vacant, and then begins to shift support to Monophysites, who would have been the most numerous Christian community in the Roman Near East at the time. Now, so I guess after a while it would have been sort of much of a muchness. I think a Catholicos came back eventually under successive kings, but I don't quote me on that. So there would have been some. I think there would have been some return to official Diophysite Christianity. But of course, when we think of Persian Christianity, we tend to think of the Church of the East, which is mostly the way it is now, as far as I know. Although in Armenia, it's not. And Georgia, someone who knows more will have to weigh in. But in Armenia, they never bought into the settlement with the Sasanian government. They remained I think in their own view they would have remained with the faith of Nicaea. They didn't participate in the Chalcedonian Synod. They had no time for Nestorius, and no time for the official church of the Persian Empire either, despite remaining Christians.
I'm interested in the imagery here that you presented to us. Earlier you had a slide of Justinian, which would have been from Ravenna around the 6th century.
Yeah.
So that's the far western part of the empire. And then you showed us some images of coins and maybe sarcophagi where you have imagery in the Sasanian part of the empire. I'm interested in the kind of the Christian and Zoroastrian imagery that would have been prevalent in kind of their temples or in the churches. I didn't see any images of people in the images that you've shown that were not Christian, but I could be wrong. So was there kind of like an iconoclasm within this Sasanian dynasty with regards to images in both the Zoroastrian, I guess, temples or even the Christian churches? Or I'm just kind of interested. I don't know.
That's a good question. The short answer is that no, there was no Zoroastrian iconoclasm. Although I think I've seen a paper that it's called like Zoroastrian iconoclasm ? But there are statues of Persian kings that still survive. There are mosaics made in the ruins of palaces that have survived. There are mosaics that are made in imitation of Greco-Roman forms that depict people and animals. And there is a famous passage in the history of Tabari where the Arabs have conquered Ctesiphon, and they've gone into the this arch. It's called a Avan in Persian. They go into it and they start saying the Friday prayers. And Tabri notes there were statues of men and horses looking down on them as they prayed. So, and the Muslims didn't bother to take them away, which suggests that there would have been, rich decoration, maybe in stucco or stone or something. But the problem is that so little material culture has survived from this period. The main problem is that everything was, almost everything, was made of mud brick, as was the old city of Baghdad. Very little of which survives. I shouldn't say none, but very little. This is made of brick, of a sturdier sort. But no iconoclasm.
And for the inscription on the Justinian would have been in Latin script at the time.
Yeah.
But you showed some script in, was that Arabic or?
So this.
Your final slide.
Oh, in the final slide?
Yeah. Like, what would be the inscriptions that the Christians and the Sasanians, the Zoroastrians would have used? The language. Sorry, is that Christian?
This is Arabic from the interior of the Dome of the Rock.
Okay, the Dome of the Rock. Okay.
And this on both. So this is a kind of Arabic on the right hand coin, which says there's no God but God and Muhammad's prophet. This on the left is an inscription using a variation of the Aramaic alphabet, but writing the Middle Persian language. And I will not attempt to decipher it because it's too hard. The way that language works, it's actually a normal language. Like if you were speaking it, it wouldn't seem particularly weird. But when you write it in Aramaic, and you pronounce it in Persian. Yeah.
Yeah, in India there's some monuments that have that similar, that the word in Persian written in.
Yeah. So this is another example, by the way. People often debate whether, I don't know, often is the right word, but people have debated whether the Sasanian monarchy was a highly centralized state like the later Roman Empire, or whether it was a kind of heterogeneous mass of like feudal like kingdoms and that sort of thing. The idea of a written language that you had to be formally trained for years in order to be able to even to get the rudiments implies, I think, an extraordinary amount of central control from an office that would have, enforced training for scribes and standards and so forth. Otherwise, I have no means of explaining why such a strange method of writing would have endured.
Thank you.
Sorry, I have a quick question. Do you know of any elements within the Zoroastrian religion that makes the transition or the conversion to Christianity more familiar or more likely? Specifically with regards to ritual? You mentioned the fire temples, but I was just wondering because I'm quite curious about the Zoroastrian religion and how it survives today and what the rituals are and how that sort of prefigures and the Christian religion within this time of history as well.
It's a good question. I think that the similarities. It depends who you ask, but in the Sasanian period, I think that the Zoroastrian religion is very clearly both dualist and polytheist, whereby you have the idea that the classic Zoroastrian idea of two rival gods and two light and dark and summer and winter, a series of sort of intermediary deities, like angels or what have you. And the main similarity with Christianity, I think, is that you have an idea of like a flow of time toward through a series of ages and then a kind of end. You have the idea of a Zoroastrian, what we would call an apocalypse, and that apocalypse includes a dragon falling to earth and being killed, and tests for the righteous, and heaven and hell.
So in terms of like an afterlife, is there?
There are ideas of an afterlife, yeah. But ritual, I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. Like, we know that there were fire temples, but I don't know enough to say whether they would have functioned like a local church, for example. Did people show up and just sort of spend a morning once a week there? Or I personally, I doubt it, but I don't know if anyone has looked into it enough to say. But it's an interesting fact that the three wise men that visited the baby Jesus are supposed to be Zoroastrians. Like, that's what Magoi mean, right? So, when that was written down, I wonder whether it could have been understood in any other way. But there was, what am I saying here? There was clearly enough of a similarity for the kind of links that I described to have been made and to, I think, make sense. Sorry, this guy was.
There is some, and it has nothing to do with ritual, but there's a bit of religious studies scholarship in the past century that's talked about the influence of Zoroastrianism on demonology in the Eastern churches,
that makes sense.
Angelology and demonology, especially the development of Satan in the way that he's popularly understood.
Thank you very much for your presentation, which was very helpful to kind of see what's going on east of Byzantium, which I only knew in bits and pieces. I was wondering, you mentioned the preference for so-called Nestorian Christianity in the Sasanian Empire, but you also mentioned the policies of Khosrow II, and in later periods there's a presence of so-called Melkite Christians in the territory of the former Sasanian Empire. I was wondering if there's any discussion about between various Christian minorities in that part of the world, or was it pretty much uniform in the sources during the Sasanian period, and then there could have been diversity only later because of Arab conquests?
I think that's a very good question. I think that there is evidence of tension amongst Christian communities, but they all, which probably signify the kind of doctrinal differences that you refer to. But in the sources, they are described like this. There's some sort of massive uprising in a city, and then the Persian king sends an army and kills everyone. I think that, and there are chronicles, of course, that appear to allude to such events, but of course they're always taking one side in it and minimizing the effect and ferocity of the violence. So I don't know. I don't know whether we'll ever gain much insight into that. But despite the official sanction for Diophysite Christianity, there must have been a very wide variety of Christologies, which from time to time provoked debate and conflict.
Yes, I actually have quite a few questions.
Okay.
It's an enormous topic.
I'm ready.
And I really admire your courage in first thing that occurred to me was that you didn't mention the Apostle Thomas, the Apostle of the East, the patron saint of India, and I suspect as well the patron saint of Iran, who legend says, and there's some documentation for it, went as far east as the northeastern part of the Parthian Empire.
Yeah.
Right? That's what the legend says. So that's the first point.
Right.
The second point is Khusro and Shireen.
Yeah.
I was quite surprised that you didn't mention anything about the legend of Khusro and Shireen. It's a major motif in Persian poetry.
Yep.
And Khusro was supposedly Zoroastrian and Shireen was supposedly a Christian. And surely that's of some significance.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's Saint Sergius, who kind of is a puzzle to me. You know, there's this pair, Sergius and Bacchus.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a legend that Saint Sergius was a Persian. And so I don't know much about that, and if you could enlighten me about that a little bit, I'd appreciate it. And then finally, the Arab conquest, and before that, the official religion of Iran. Did the Persians see the Arabs, the first Muslims, as a Christian heresy, the way certain other people during medieval times saw them, especially in early medieval times? Or did they see them as a separate, entirely separate religion? So I think I'll stop there. That's rather a lot.
Okay. So first, I have to plead total ignorance on the topic of St. Sergius. But I too have heard that he was a Persian, but I've unfortunately not looked into it any further. Let's start with the Arab conquest. Okay. The fundamental problem with understanding that period is that all of the Arabic sources that are supposedly based on word-of-mouth reports and traditions that go back to participants in the event, they are all almost certainly wrong. And even if they were not wrong, even if we could demonstrate that the various persons, let's say the names, even if they're all accurate, they are not historical narratives so much as sort of details about who was at a given place at a given time, who was the first to cross the river, or who was the one who defeated whom in single combat. So it's hard to believe that just by stringing all these different reports together, such as you find in Tabari or Baladhuri or Dinawari, or whatever, that you get an accurate picture or a narrative of what happened. But of course, if you do that, the result is the religion of Islam is fully formed. Everyone who participates in the conquest is a Muslim, just as you would have found, and they believe just as a Muslim would have believed 300 years later in the Abbasid period, and that they are all motivated by the beliefs promoted by Muhammad. There isn't even a reference, well, there are kind of vague references to this central command from Medina, but that doesn't even come into focus very much. It's all about the participants, who they are, where they come from, a little bit about what they did, and religious enthusiasm. Additionally, the date of those the dates associated with the later Arabic narratives are not corroborated by, or often they are not corroborated by external sources. So, for example, sources in Syriac and Greek and in Armenian, they all show that the invasions the sort of exodus of Arabs from the peninsula are occurring well within the lifetime of Muhammad, who supposedly died in 632. The history of Dinawari, incidentally, who is a Muslim writer, is the exception to the Arab consensus, who says that it was in the reign of Queen Boran, who's coming a little bit after Khosrow II in about 629, 630. It was in the reign of Queen Boran that the Arab incursions began to cross into Iran, which suggests that the invasions are beginning. It's not a suggestion, that it is a declaration that the invasions are beginning in the lifetime of Muhammad. Now, another interesting fact is that the Arabic sources claim that Muhammad's preaching had influenced all of the Arabian Peninsula, and then at his death there's sort of widespread apostasy, and then various people such as Khalid ibn Walid and other commanders who figure prominently later reconquered the peninsula in a single year and put down a variety of pseudo-prophets who arose in different corners of Arabia and returned the community of Arabs to Islam. I think that what this is actually covering up is that Muhammad was one of many religious holy men at the time, and not all of them were men. We know of at least 2 female prophets. In the north eastern part of the Arabian Peninsula, there was a prophetess who is mentioned by all of the Muslim accounts. Her name is Sajah, and she was a Christian. And it was under her, it was at her instigation, and this is mentioned even in Arabic sources. It was at her instigation that the first penetrations of Iran began in the lifetime of Muhammad, which suggests that the Arab conquests began simply as an attempt to take advantage of a weak security situation after the end of the last war in antiquity. Had little to do initially with Muhammad or his preaching, at least as far as the Iranian invasion was concerned. And many of the participants, at least early on, would have been Christians. To me, I think that's incontrovertible.
Wow.
But that's not the Orthodox account. There are traces of it in the Orthodox account, and of course, eventually, commanders like Khalid ibn Walid and Sa'ad ibn Abu Waqas and so forth, they eventually co-opt the movement of tribes into Iran and eventually organize, a full conquest of the Iranian plateau in the service of the empire at Medina. But this is reimagined as a project beginning from the death of Muhammad, with the strings being pulled by the first couple of caliphs after a single year of apostasy, and then suddenly the Near East is Muslim. But I don't believe it.
So the question basically had to do with the nature of early Islam.
Yeah, I think that.
And the view of outsiders. We know that the first Christians in Palestine and Armenia did not call them Muslims. They called them other things.
Yeah.
I forget what Hagarenes and things like this.
Exactly.
Ethnic, not religious terms. So possibly, it's quite possible, because of that incontrovertible fact, that they saw them as Christians of a different sort. My question was, to the subjects of the Shah, did they also see the early Muslims as Christians of a different sort? For example, Armenia is largely under the Persians during its day. The early Armenian chronicles, what would they say about this? But anyhow, it's a very big question. I don't want to answer.
No, I can tell you what they say. Sebeos and whoever wrote the Sebeos is an Armenian historian, and whoever wrote the Syriac history of Khuzestan, or so-called history of Khuzestan, they both and these are written within decades of the events that they describe. They both mention Muhammad, that he was the Arabian prophet. Sebeos is very clear that Muhammad was a merchant, which is an unusual detail to include, or that he had been a merchant, which is an unusual detail to conclude if it were not something that he had actually heard. They are very clear that the Arabs are unambiguously monotheists. They have only one God. There's some connection with the offspring of Hagar and Ishmael, and we don't get much details about that. Sebeos claims that they're advertising that they are reclaiming their ancestral patrimony by conquering what we would call the Holy Land. And in the Chronicle of Khuzestan, there's a mention of something called the Dome of Abraham, which they venerate, which is probably the Kaaba, although it's curious that it's called a dome, since it isn't a dome now. So I think by the time anyone had a chance to reflect upon what had happened, that it was clear that some new form of a monotheist religion had taken hold. But there is no mention in those sources that it could be construed as a Christian heresy. But there is, reading between the lines, there is a very strong suggestion in those two sources that it is viewed that what we now call Islam is viewed as a Jewish heresy. And there is a statement to this effect in something called the Doctrina Jacobi, which is a Greek text composed, I think, in 630, maybe. It's somewhere between 630 and it would be no later than 634. But it describes a dialogue between two Jewish men in somewhere in Egypt, closer to the, I think, northeastern part of Egypt, where they're debating whether this Arabian prophet, whom they don't mention in by name, is really a prophet, or whether he's a sort of precursor of the appearance of the Messiah. And one of them has his doubts. But to my way of thinking, you sort of read that together with what Sebeos is saying about Ishmael and Hagar and so forth, and you have a picture of people who clearly understand the new religion as a kind of species of Judaism. But in the East, in Iran, I don't know. The sources that we have that comment on Islam, such as the Shahnameh or something, it's coming from it's so late. But you do find these sort of strange. There's the so-called prophecy of Rostam. Rostam was the commander who died resisting the Arabs. He talks about how the monarchy is going to collapse, and the doom of Iran is coming. Taking obviously a very dim view of the Arab conquest, but as you would expect, not much of a comment on what they believe, since it was written by an ostensibly Orthodox Muslim for Muslim patrons, and whatever Zoroastrians thought about the Muslim religion, I don't know if we'll ever really know. St. Thomas. Okay, St. Thomas. I think that legend is probably true. I can't prove it. Whether it's true or not, it obviously had a profound effect. There's probably some reminiscence of it in the story of the appearance of the apostle at the court of Ardashir, which is also probably bound up with the legend of Adai and the Abgar of Edessa. But is he the patron saint of Persia? I don't know.
No. If you say a prayer, there's Marthas.
Who's that?
Marthas.
Marthas.
Interesting.
He was a colleague of John Chrysostom. He was a martyr
Interesting.
who died in Iran.
That's interesting.
But
Of all of Iran, or just the Church of the East?
He's a patron saint of Iran. I know.
Maybe that's a Catholic. Well, I'm Catholic.
there's
It might be an Orthodox thing.
a saint called Saint Anastasius the Persian, who his name was originally Magun Dad, and he converted. He's a sort of like a Don Quixote figure. He was determined to become a martyr in the war between Persia and Byzantium in the 7th century, and he kept trying to get himself killed. It didn't work. And then he eventually converted, I think, at Caesarea, and he was imprisoned and forced to do hard labor. And if I remember correctly, he was in Ctesiphon when the cross was brought back and in some sort of procession and given to Shirin. And the life of St. Anastasius the Persian, which is written in Greek, is the only source that gives a sense of what life would have been like during that war between Khosrow and Heraclius, and it gives a portrait of life under the Persian occupation. So he should be the patron saint of
Anastasius the Persian.
yeah. I would hope, but if it's Marthas or whoever. Oh, Maruthas.
Yeah.
Marutha was.
No.
Sorry?
Is that the same Marutha? He's because he gives us an account of the Marutha is one of the earliest sources in the Great Blessing of Water. So.
Interesting. There were a couple of people named Marutha, but Marutha was Yasgard the First had a doctor named Marutha. And Marutha was supposedly sent to cure the headaches of Yasgard's son, or maybe it was Yasgard himself. Anyway, someone had headaches, and the Zoroastrian doctors could not cure it, but Marutha could. And then he became highly influential. This sounds like the sort of made-up history that you find in Herodotus or something. But there was clearly a close relationship between Yasgard and Marutha. Okay, Khosrow and Shirin. Khosrow had many wives. No one should deceive himself. He would have. Tabari describes him having thousands of wives. So Shirin is just the most famous one. She was supposedly an Aramean Christian from Mesopotamia. She was by far the most influential. She was advertised as the sort of conduit between Iranian Christians and the king. she received the Holy Cross from Jerusalem when it was stolen as a present. And she was the mother of, I'm not going to get this right. There was a sort of succession crisis at the death, when Khosrow II was murdered, and there was a question of who would be, and I think Shirin's son was imprisoned so that someone else could succeed, but then Heraclius intervened and got the son of Shirin out. He didn't last very long on the throne. But there was a hope, because of Shirin, I think, that eventually there would have been a Christian monarch on the Sasanian throne, and I think that Heraclius tried to make that happen. Shirin is the subject of all these sort of romantic stories that come later. The Shahnameh has no account of the war between Rome and Persia for various strange reasons. Ferdowsi omitted it. And he fills the space with dozens of stories about Khosrow and Shirin, all of which are mendacious and strange intrigues and feasting and that sort of thing. But in poetry of the Muslim age, Khosrow and Shirin are always cited as the sort of ideal lovers, and all sorts of romantic exploits are associated with them, and they were the subject of at least one long epic by Khagani, Nizami, right, and possibly others. So, thank you. Thanks for coming.